All right, we're going to take a quick break from your calls because every once in a while we like to invite researchers or scientists onto the show to share with us the results of a new scientific study that they've published for a little segment we call What You Got.
Hey! What you got?
Joining us for this What You Got, Dr. Craig Harper, a senior lecturer in psychology at Nottingham Trent University in the UK. Hey, Dr. Harper, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Really good. Thanks for jumping on the phone. So what do you got?
We've been doing some really cool research, actually, I think, into sex doll ownership. So I guess we're aware of kind of lots of people who are having lots of kind of emotive responses to things like sex dolls and associating it with risk and having this idea of kind of people who own sex dolls being sexually deviant and things like that. But there's no evidence for any of this. There's nothing at all. We've got lots of people advocating for kind of criminalization, things like that, but no data whatsoever. So what we decided to do was to test some of these ideas. We had 3 different models that we were looking at. So is it possible that sex dolls are protective against sexual risk? Do they increase sexual risk? Or are they just, as they're described, sex toys that people use for sexual gratification, sexual enhancement, and things like that? So we've been testing some of those ideas out with sex doll owners and comparing those scores to people who don't own sex dolls.
Okay, so quickly, let me jump in. I want to clarify the things that people emote about a lot when they talk about sex dolls are that they're going to contribute to, patriarchal, misogynistic attitudes, that women are objects that should do what you want them to do and be right where you want them to be and be used exactly how you want to use them. And that sex dolls, if they take off, and they really, we talk about sex dolls a lot more than any of us, I think, have encountered them in the wild. But if they were to take off, it would make an already bleak situation for women, culturally, sexually, romantically, even bleaker. That's what you meant by the emoting people are doing about sex dolls.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the key kind of driver, I guess, that's driving a lot of social discussions about this. But like I say, there's no data that supports any of that. There's no research that supports that. And what a lot of these arguments are doing is they're arguing, like you say, from emotion. They're thinking about kind of the situation that women find themselves in at the moment, and thinking about what the kind of slippery slope could be if these dolls take off.
Well, it's a situation women have been in for millennia, and it's a situation that women today have, for the last century, have fought really hard to make less bad. And people, women, men, myself included, don't want to see things get worse, although that does seem to be the motto of the 21st century, things get worse. All right, so what did you find in your research?
Well, I guess I suppose the interesting thing really is that we found very little. So we compared the scores, like I said, of sex doll owners. We had 158 sex doll owners, and we recruited a comparison group of 135 people who don't own sex dolls. These are all men, and we were looking at whether they differed on things like their level of sexual fantasizing, what they fantasize about, their personality traits, how well they function emotionally, their attachment styles. But importantly, how they view women, and do they have these things called offense-supportive cognitions, these kind of pro-criminal attitudes that might be associated, at least theoretically, with sexual offending. And like I say, in the main, we found very few differences. We did see, interestingly, that people who own sex dolls were less likely to report being aroused by sexually aggressive scenarios. So we take that as an indication, or the literature as well takes that as an indication of them being less likely to act on any potential kind of offense-supportive fantasies that they might have. But interestingly, people who didn't own sex dolls also had the higher levels of beastophilic fantasy. So people who don't own sex dolls seem to have slightly higher levels of fantasies around kind of coercive sex. So again, we're seeing this idea potentially, and this is all kind of potentially at the moment because this is relatively small sample sizes, but an initial look at doll ownership, of sex dolls being maybe protective against sexual aggression. In terms of personality, again, we found very few differences. People who own sex dolls were more likely to have obsessive-compulsive personality traits. So they have this kind of desire for control or for order, maybe. And that might be indicative of the fact that a lot of the guys that were in our sex doll owner sample had really poor quality past relationships. And we've also got some qualitative data, actually, some interview data that seems to suggest that people seek out sex dolls as a form of sexual outlet a lot of the time because of these past negative experiences with relationships with women. We did also find that men who own sex dolls have lower levels of sexual self-esteem as well. So again, kind of tapping into this idea of poor quality sexual histories, maybe kind of driving people into using sex dolls or owning sex dolls, but we didn't find any evidence whatsoever that sex dolls increase levels of sexual aggression risk.
And you did find that in your control group, in the sample of men who didn't own sex dolls, more evidence of sexually aggressive attitudes or shittier men were in the average, in the mean.
Well, I guess that would be one way of putting it.
So we should all go out there. We should be looking for guys. Women should be looking for guys who own sex dolls because they're the safer bet.
Well, the one thing I would flag is that particular variable was not significantly different between the two groups. It was a slight difference, but statistically indistinguishable. So I wouldn't necessarily be saying to women that they should be going out finding guys with sex dolls. That wouldn't be the case. But certainly from a policy perspective, from a kind of social discussion perspective, the idea that dolls increase sexual aggression risk doesn't seem to be evident in our data.
Okay, I mean, there's so much to think about and attempt to unpack here. My hunch. One of the things when we talk about sex dolls, we're also talking about sex robots. And usually that discussion about the coming of the sex robots, which always seems to be 20 years, 30 years out on the horizon, that gets sort of rolled into the discussion of the sex dolls that are on the market now. And the attitude often is, this is going to take the place of human relationships that people might have. But my feeling, one of my takes on the coming of the sex robots is it's going to make a kind of relationship possible for a lot of people who are socially at a disadvantage or socially maladapted in some way. Not that they're violent, not that they're aggressive or want to harm or control women, but just there are people out there who want partners who can't find them, who've tried and failed, and it's a miserable experience for them. And this may be an outlet, a way for someone to have a partner who might not otherwise have a partner. And that seems to be that hunch of mine seems to be borne out a little bit by your data or by what you found.
Yeah, definitely. So that does seem to be the case in our. So there's hints of that in our quantitative data, in this survey data. There's much more of that actually in our interview data. So that research is currently being kind of reviewed at journals. So that was led by my colleague Rebecca Leasley. But we're seeing evidence of that in the interview data as well. So kind of themes around kind of seeing deficits in themselves, particularly among doll owners, in terms of interacting with women, but also seeing deficits in other people. So thinking about kind of what they have in their mind as being the ideal relationship, and kind of having living partners maybe not living up to those expectations, may be a driver for some of these guys in seeking sex doll ownership. And what I would say is that it's really important for us to not think about sex doll owners as kind of one group. There are lots of different motivators for why people own or use sex dolls. Obviously, for a lot of people, for the vast majority of people, they'll be using these or owning these items for sexual gratification. For others, like you've kind of alluded to, it will be about relationships and about emotional support. For others, we've got quite a lot of evidence actually about some people just owning sex dolls to have someone around, so not necessarily having a relationship with that doll or having a pseudo relationship with that doll, but just to have someone around. Equally for things like photography, it seems to be quite common for people to have dolls for kind of artistic reasons as well. So I think we have this idea in our mind, this kind of heuristic view of why do people own sex dolls, and we see this through a kind of, a deviant sexuality kind of lens, where actually there are multifaceted reasons for people owning these kinds of dolls.
It does seem to me that if you regarded the sex doll as a sex toy for men, that there's sometimes even in sex positive communities, even among people who are comfortable with sex toys in general, there's this stigma attached to sex toys that you fuck a fleshlight or an orifice, and what a sex doll is a fleshlight attached to a mannequin. And even among women I know who are comfortable with the idea of there being insertion toys for women, vibrators, dildos, they're very uncomfortable around the idea of there being insertion toys for men, that a fleshlight is somehow inherently creepier or grosser or more disgusting for a person to use than an insertable vibrating dildo. And I find that disconnect and that discomfort among some fascinating. But I wanted to add two more questions before I let you go. And you've been very generous with your time. Thank you. Where did you find the sex doll owners who are willing to participate in the study?
So it's a really good question. So there are lots of different communities online of guys who own sex dolls. We were really keen not to identify people. So where there are kind of forums, we were very clear that we wouldn't name forums publicly of where we found these individuals, because naturally they are quite kind of protective about their identities. But there are kind of relatively high profile forums online that you can kind of ask people to take part in this kind of research. And naturally, because of the stigma that is around sex doll ownership, they are a little bit sometimes kind of hesitant, I guess. We've tried really hard to develop some of these relationships with guys on forums, really trying to kind of learn what they're about and why they're owning sex dolls, and kind of really trying to tell their story, I guess, as well as the story that society is trying to tell about them. And I think that kind of involvement of guys who use these sex dolls is really going to be important as we kind of progress this research over the next couple of years.
So inevitably, when you have these conversations about sex dolls, one of the things that comes up is sex dolls, lumps of latex or polystyrene or whatever that look like a child.
Yep.
A child sex doll. That makes people insanely uncomfortable. That makes me uncomfortable. The other thing that makes people uncomfortable is when you ask, if pedophiles were less likely to rape children, if sex dolls were available that looked like children, would that not be for the good? As uncomfortable as the idea of a sex doll that looks like a child makes all of us.
Yep.
Have you thought about that? Are you doing any research in that area?
We have, we do have data on childlike dolls. I'm hesitant to talk about the results at the moment because we are still having those data reviewed. So we do have a preprint. If people want to follow me on Twitter, I'm more than happy to share that. I've shared that preprint relatively recently, actually.
It sounds like you're still collecting your thoughts on it, but will you please come back after that paper is out?
100%, yeah.
All right, where can people find you online to learn more about your research, and where can people find the paper that you've just released on sex dolls?
Well, I guess the best way to find me online is through Twitter. So I'm at Craig Harper 19. That's Craig Harper 19. And the paper on sex dolls is published now in the Journal of Sex Research. So if you go to their website, it's available open access. You just go to their website, search for sex doll owners and psychology, and you'll find our paper on the search bar.
Dr. Craig Harper, Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Nottingham Trent University of the United Kingdom. Thank you so much, Dr. Harper, for getting on the phone today. That was a fascinating conversation.
Thanks very much.